And now it's my pleasure to welcome my co-host, Sharon Fields.
Thank you, Doreen. Good morning.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you are when you're actually listening to this. It's my pleasure today to introduce my friend and colleague and fellow writer, Sarah Kobrus. Sarah has lived overseas for many years, and actually she was in Bahrain while I was in Saudi, but we didn't meet each other until many years later. She has been a counselor. She has worked with NGOs, and she is currently the affiliate director of Families in Global Transition. So it's my pleasure to welcome my friend and colleague today, Sarah Kobrus.
And it's delightful to be here from an afternoon of unusual sunshine for the northwest of England. So I'm from the derivative of Doreen Cumberford's name. I'm from Cumberland in Cumbria in the northwest of England.
Yeah, she's living in my queendom. I wish. So Sharon, why don't you go ahead and ask the first question?
I'd love to. I'd love to get us our conversation started today. Sarah, tell our listeners and share with us, what is emotional logic?
Very good question. And I will try and keep it as simple as possible. So emotional logic is a clear, practical, therapeutic way through emotional turmoil that helps anyone grow through times of loss and grief.
Very good. Very good.
And a very big promise. But now with 10 years of using it in many situations, because I'm also a social worker, a human, studying about the human system nerd. And so in 30 years of social work, counselling, and now emotional logic practice, it really is a hidden gem.
Oh, I'm so happy that you wrote this book because it really breaks down things very slowly and covers a lot of things that I think you and I have talked about in the past. Tell us about the book. The name of the book is Good Grief. Could you please tell us the subtitle and a little bit about the community that you wrote this for?
So the full title is Good Grief, Transforming Loss into Hope and Resilience. And for the Globally Nomad, because that is my family, that is my tribe. I lived internationally for 18 years, well, almost 20. And I've lived in America, I've lived in Bahrain, I've lived in Qatar, I've lived in Holland, I've lived in France, and then we went back to Qatar with 3 now adult ATCKs. And yeah, at a relatively young age, I did experience what most people go through in their lifetime, but condensed into a very short period of time. So when my family was very young, we had 2 traumatic bereavements of grandfathers, my children's grandfathers, and also closely followed by a cancer diagnosis. And in the middle of that, of the Second Iraq War, and having to leave Doha at very short notice and back to very difficult home situations back in home. And we had to at the same time leave my husband back in Doha, because companies, big international oil companies, they airlifted all of their employees out. But those of us working for the National Oil Refinery, it was men and women, but predominantly men, were not given exit visas. So I had to go back to England with 3 small children. So having been through all of that, at that point of time in my life, I was a social worker and counsellor. And to be honest, there was a lot of stuff helping us share our experiences of trauma, but very, very little that would help people process in ways that could convert that energy into positive states of being. And what happens when a lot of people start talking or expressing their trauma, they physically relive it. So yes, emotional logic was a big stepping stone in me finding something that would practically work for anybody, anywhere. But what was so embedded in universal truths that it wouldn't just help my Globally Nomad family, it would help anybody experiencing emotional turmoil.
So, Sarah, who grieves? A special person that grieves? Only special people? Or do we all grieve at certain times in our lives?
Absolutely. I think we have tended to compartmentalize grief, that it's only to do with the loss of somebody we love, and let's name it the death of somebody we love, when I've come to know that the accumulating and compounding loss that we experience as globally mobile people, global nomads, is grief. It is grief. And it's especially significant for our children who are their bodies, their nervous systems, their brains, their personality, their character, their whole development is being shaped by more loss and grief before they reach the age of 18 than the average stay-at-home person experiences in their lifetime. And so it was quite hard back when I was experiencing all my stuff when my kids were young, because how do you talk about grief in ways that aren't safe, that are really safe? Because most of us, those really uncomfortable emotions, we don't have a language for, we don't have a shared language for. And, you know, as expats, we do like to focus on the good stuff in a really good way. You know, we're optimistic, go-getting, active people, or we wouldn't be doing this life.
Yeah, that's a great point. Great point.
So I just want to make one very tiny story, and that is I had a miscarriage when we were in Japan. We were in Japan for 2 years, and I had a miscarriage. And I remember my 2-year-old was so excited about going to have a brother. And I remember telling her in the bathtub that night, you know, no brother would be forthcoming. And I could really sense the grieving that went on inside that little 2-year-old's body. I mean, I'm fairly intuitive. I think that's a common Scottish thing sometimes. But I remember really getting the sense of it, Sarah, of how hard that was. And I'd like to bring Sharon's experience into this conversation, because Sharon's international journey has been motivated by the subject of grief and by the loss of her husband. Can you tell us a little bit about how you became globally mobile, Sharon? Because I think it really informs the depth of this conversation.
Sure. So I was married and had a child and a house and a career. And, you know, all those lovely things that we're supposed to do. And we're told, oh, we can't travel. You can't travel. Why would you leave all of this to go anywhere? And my husband was diagnosed with cancer. And 2 years later, we lost him. And so at that point, I had to decide, what do I want to do? What am I going to be? What, you know, and I'm basically an optimistic person, or at least I try to be. And as you said, Sarah, you take one day at a time, one step at a time. And as you progress, you try to release that grief. You really do, because it really becomes a burden to carry around with you. And no one else really truly understands each individual's depth of grief, I guess. And so I think people like you writing about it, and people like me buying the books to read to help ourselves, We've got to spread that there is help out there, and that there are better ways to deal with that nowadays, rather than stuffing it back down. You know, for generations, we didn't talk about mental health issues or grief or how that affects us. And now we're starting to see how it does help to talk and work through situations and move forward.
So can you tell us? Go ahead.
What I love about emotional logic, it isn't just talking about it. It gives you the incredibly practical, but also creative framework that individuals can use, families can use, communities can use, which I've never seen anything else work in the same way. Because just talking about your grief can be very triggering.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
So it's a complete reframe and shift in mindset that is a whole body body, mind, physiological experience within a very clear framework. So this is where the emotional logic, the paradox, comes into it, because the emotional is thinking about the energy in your emotions, your grief emotions. And then the logic is that there is a clear system, pathway of practical tools to help you process that grief. So it really is like joining the dots in all of that with emotional logic, but in such a creative way, but is really, really clear at the same time. So, yeah.
I'll just add real quickly that last night I had a dream about my husband, and he had not passed away. And I think a lot of it was triggered from the fact of, that we were going to talk with you today. It's amazing how it just comes out of nowhere, and things that trigger those thoughts and feelings.
Emotional logic gives you, it really restores your inner safe place.
Talk to us about safe places. Tell us about safe places.
Yeah, because this is as a social worker, it is just I'm a child protection social worker in my initial training. So this is the key foundation that we all need when we experience any kind of a shock. It is so physiological. So by shock, it is anything, either a threat or a real loss. It's the way our brain and our body operate to protect ourselves. So most people know about this, fight, flight, freeze, and also the new one, which is fawning. So it's our body trying to protect itself. So what happens is there is a physiological reaction we have no control over, with hormones called adrenaline, cortisol. That in a nanosecond go up to our brain, and that shuts down the front cortex of your brain, which is the thinking, the choice, the later development of the brain, called your executive function. And at the same time, it's setting off your amygdala. Well, if you just think of your amygdala as like the fire station in your brain that's just flashing warning, warning, warning. So all of that makes your front cortex, which is the really clever thinking that we need to cope in situations, it sends it offline. So that's why all those sensations are absolutely overwhelming, because our amygdala is in control. I can see Sharon. I wish the listeners could see Sharon. You know that feeling, don't you? You absolutely know that feeling.
Right.
So if I was to tell you right now that feeling has a meaning and a useful purpose, which you then know. So this is where the logic comes in. So you know the emotion now of shock. You know it's physiological and it's going on in your brain. It's neuroscience going on here and biochemistry. So can I read you what shock, the meaning and useful purpose of shock?
Sure. Just a couple of sentences.
Yes, absolutely. So shock, this is your moment. So shock means you're doubting that you can cope. Shock is useful because it reminds you to find a safe place. Remember what you've got and then plan what to do. All of those chemicals rushing around in your body take 10 minutes for your body to process. And they're there, so you can go off and fight a saber-toothed tiger. So the mother can lift the car off the child who's been knocked over. We need it, but the thing is, in our modern world, so much is not real threat, it's just perceived threat. So once you know and recognize that red flag of shock, you need to give yourself 10 minutes for all those chemicals to calm down, for your amygdala to set up its warning, and then have it done its job to quieten down as your front cortex comes back online.
And in coaching, we call that pause. Is when someone is going into their story again, or they're triggered or something, it's hit the pause button, because hitting the pause button, remember the days there was a store in America that was giving out big buttons that said pause on them. and people were given them whenever I think it was like Home Depot or somewhere. And people, when I came back from Saudi, people all over the country had these pause buttons. And I was like, what is that for? And now I wish I had one because I have a real use for it. This is a very practical way of describing the anatomical, and the physiological reaction, right?
It's the state of being.
Exactly.
Of being. And then, but the central thing about safe places is with practice, because it will actually start rewiring your neural pathways. So this is how you get back control, because at its core, emotional logic is a practical embodiment of the Serenity Prayer. This is why safe places is so core. Whatever the experience you've had, you can get back being your own safe place. Those neurological and physiological reactions that you have no control of, you know what's happening and you know what you need to do. And of course, safe places, they are people, they are places, they are things, they are our own senses. It's deeper than a pause. It's to absolutely rewire yourself. There's a whole other, I could go, as you know, Doreen, my passion for this, I could go on forever. But if that's the gem that I would like anybody listening to take away, that this is a way to neurologically and physiologically rewire. So you're able to, it gives you the serenity to accept what you cannot change, the courage to change what you can, and the wisdom to know the difference, but in a really practical way, literally down to an activity pack. And so the tools, the several key ones, which we won't go into now, I've just described SHOT as in one of the seven stepping stones.
I was going to ask you about the 7 stepping stones in just a moment, but I do think this is the first time I've heard you clearly articulate, the difference between taking the pause and actually retraining our brain, because that's what we're constantly doing. Every new habit that we are trying to establish, every old habit, every moment, it's really creating a heightened sense of awareness and a heightened sense of being, right?
Yeah, and recovering that sense of safety within your own body first, and then part of planning what to do next is solution focused action plans. We call them SMART plans, which are more familiar. But the reason it really shifts stuff is the tools. It's value based. We grieve because we love. Your own body lose something because you care about it, and that's why it really shifts things, because it's a process of filtering what's real from what is unhealthy mindsets, self-limiting beliefs. But it does it in a really practical way, and as you said, it sifts out what is a real loss from what is the worry or fear of a loss in a really practical way, and gets to the core of your values, so you can then decide, where am I going to focus my energy? What can I control? Don't waste any more time on the things I can't control. Let me focus the energy I've got on what I can control.
And what I would love for our listeners to get out of this is I think that there's a lot of, you and I have talked about hidden grief. And the fact that we don't talk about grieving in the expat community. I mean, it's almost like it's been anathema, or it's like a dirty little secret. But, I think about all the expats that Sharon and I are surrounded by down here, who are living distantly from their families, from their beloveds, from their grandchildren, Sharon included, and I, and what that does to you at depth. And I believe that every single one of us should have an awareness that there is some grieving going on in the background somewhere. There must be somewhere if we're functioning well. I mean, it's wonderful to set off on this great new lifestyle that we have in our 3rd chapter. And what is the hidden cost that we don't sit down and look at? So can you give our listeners just a little bit of insight into where to start thinking about the grief and where it fits into the expat journey, particularly, really at any stage of life?
I think it's a normal human thing. let me reframe that. I think particularly in our Western culture, we tend to want to gloss over loss.
Yes.
We want to protect ourselves from pain. It's a completely normal, human reaction. And part of what I've just described isn't our brain tripping us up. Our brain's trying to protect us.
Yes.
Our brain's trying to protect us. So what emotional logic will give you over time, all of this takes time. It takes practice. It takes baby steps. Particularly if you're really rawly grieving, whether that's the death of a loved one or a death of a dream or a death of a season of your life. Endings are hard. But what I've learned is if we embrace pain, emotional logic will show you how to do this step by step.
I would also posit that living in Mexico does the same thing, because I have never been as comfortable with grief and dying as I have since I've lived here. Sharon, would you tell us a little bit about what we're about to experience in the next 2 weeks here in San Miguel? Tell Sarah how wild it is, but I find it all incredibly cathartic. In fact, I'm about to start building my own altar in my house for my ancestors. Tell us.
I think we can learn a lot from different cultures. And Absolutely. The Mexican culture I'm finding, I think Doreen is finding as well, is they're beautiful people. They're accepting, they're warm, they're welcoming. But they're processing their grief through the Day of the Dead, which is November 1st and 2nd. So they go to great lengths to build altars of their loved ones that have passed, and they bring offerings to that altar, whether it was grandpa's favorite beer or whether it was
cigarettes.
Yes. Pieces of bread or fruit, but elaborate altars from mostly marigold flowers. And so it's a beautiful way to process that grief for them and to welcome others into their home to give offerings to these family members that we may never have known and most likely never did, but it is a great way to process their grief. And maybe that makes them a happier people. I don't know, because in their minds, the people that have passed are with them all the time.
And they take entire families to the gravesite and have picnics. And they introduce the newborn kids to the dead grandparents. Look, Granny, look who came out this year. This kid is now, 8 months old. And they sitting and I think all of that, as crazy as it might sound to some people, I think the action of the hidden parts of all of these beautiful rituals are so important. And I have found that grieving and grieving the losses in my life has been a little easier, a little steadier, a little more normalized while I've been living alongside the Mexican culture.
Beautiful illustrations of what, because I think in the West, we tend to fight the pain.
Yes.
And I think it comes with different understandings of power and control. Because we have to manage it, we have to corral it, we have to put it in its box and hide it. Whereas if you actually, and it feels scary and it feels vulnerable, absolutely. But if we open our hearts, that can actually be the energy that we need, not just to cope with this grief, but to grow through it.
Right.
And it's that but it is at the heart of a big paradox that it is through suffering. We want to take the suffering away. But if we take away the pain, we take away the grief, we also take away joy, we also take away love, we also take away hope. That the two are like night and day on a spiritual level. The two go hand in hand, and we don't want to be that. We want to separate them out, but the two go hand in hand. And so if we live a more paradoxically embracing life, transforming energy, that's ask any Holocaust, survivor. Corrie is in my book, Corrie ten Boom, and it took her till she's in her late 80s to be able to talk about it in the way she is. But now she's got no time to lose, that I can honestly say my deepest transformations have been around my deepest pain.
Yes. Well, we're about at the half-hour mark almost, and I wonder if you could just give one couple of sentences of hope and inspiration for our listeners. And I'm sure we're going to have you back, because I wanted to ask you about the stepping stones. I wanted to ask you all kinds of questions from the book. So let's just consider this part one of this journey into and alongside grief and using it as a gift. So could you give something to our listeners just as one parting thought, maybe?
All of your emotions, none of them are negative, none of them are positive. They are energy. They are spiritual, physical, mental, emotional energy. And that energy, the word emotion, if you think in your mind right now, capital E, spacebar, motion.
Energy in motion.
Energy in motion. Emotions are meant to keep us in motion. It's meant to keep us moving. And emotional logic shows you how to get unstuck, how to grow, how to move step by step, and in the most incredibly creative but clear way.
Thank you so much for this window into emotional logic and into a very practical process that I believe most of us in the Globally Mobile community could probably use at some point in our lives. And I would recommend, where can people find you?
They can find me on my website. And luckily I have a very unusual name, which, just for the record, because most people, if you think of corn on the cob, it's Kobrus. And I found out after I'd been living in the Middle East for 12 years that it's actually, Kobrus is Arabic for Cyprus, culture, and my father-in-law was from Poland. But yes, a whole other story for another time. So yeah, the best place is on my website, Sarah Kobrus. That's Sarah with an H, Kobrus, and I'll just repeat for the audio listeners, that's a K, because most people hear it as a C. And drop me a line. Very happy to have a half-hour chat with anybody interested in learning.
Thank you so much.
About me. Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah. We will have all that information in the show notes and where listeners can find your book, because I think that would
Amazon.
Wonderful for everyone to look at. Even when we repatriate, there is a loss and some grief. So I think for everyone, and we want to be mindful of your time. And so we will definitely have you back again. Thank you so much, Sarah.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah.
Bye.